Marriage, for most women of consequence, was a negotiation of silk and lineage. For Caitlin Ashdown, it was a transaction of cold copper and desperation. She didn't expect love from the Duke of Westford. She barely expected civility. But when he handed her the rusted iron keys to a derelict kitchen on their wedding night and told her to earn her keep, he thought he was breaking her spirit. He didn't realize he was handing her the keys to his entire estate. November brought a bitter chill to the moors, carrying the scent of damp earth and rot. Rain lashed us against the carriage glass in jagged streaks as Caitlin sat perfectly still, her hands folded over the wool of her travelling cloak. She was 26, a spinster by the ton's unforgiving mathematics. Her father had practically wept with relief when the Duke of Westford offered for her, eager to trade Caitlin's modest liquid dowry for the prestige of a ducal connection. No one asked why a duke would settle for the daughter of a minor baron. Caitlin knew why. The moment the carriage wheels crunched onto the unkempt gravel of Westford Abbey, the reality of Armando Coleman's desperation was laid bare. The grand estate was a towering silhouette of crumbling limestone, half swallowed by the bruised twilight. Ivy choked the eastern wing. Half the windows were shuttered, completely blind to the world. There were no footmen waiting with lanterns, no welcoming party, just the wind howling through the courtyard, rattling the loose iron hinges of the heavy oak doors. She stepped out unassisted. Her boots sank into a puddle of freezing mud. She did not flinch. Inside, the abbey smelled of wet ash and old wool. The grand foyer, designed to intimidate kings, was stripped of its tapestries. Pale squares on the walls marked where masterpieces had once hung, sold off to quiet the hounds of debt his late father had unleashed. Armando Coleman waited in the doorway of his study. He was a tall man, all sharp angles and exhausted lines. Shadows clung to the hollows of his cheeks. His coat was cut by a master tailor, but the cuffs were frayed. He looked at Caitlin not as a bride, but as a creditor who had come to collect. "You arrived?" Armando said. His voice was a low, scraping baritone, flat, devoid of any warmth. "I did, Your Grace." Caitlin kept her chin level. She did not curtsy. The mud on her boots felt heavy, but she stood tall. He stepped back, gesturing her into the study. A pathetic fire smoked in the grate, giving off more soot than heat. Armando did not offer her a chair. He walked behind his mahogany desk and picked up a heavy, rusted iron ring holding 2 massive keys. "Your father's draft cleared my father's gambling markers in London. For that, you have my gratitude, and you have my title." Armando dropped the keys onto the desk. The iron clattered loudly in the quiet room. "But if you expect courtiers, banquets, and a life of leisure, you have been severely misled. I have 12 servants left. None of them are a lady's maid." Caitlin looked at the rusted keys. "I require very little, Your Grace." "Good." Armando's jaw tightened. He hated her composure. He had expected tears. He had braced himself for hysterics, for a spoiled girl to realize she had bought a hollow crown. Her quiet dignity grated on his frayed nerves. It felt like judgment. "Because you will get nothing. The west wing is closed. The upper galleries are closed. You will take the rooms in the south corridor." "The south corridor?" Caitlin had memorized the estate plans. "Those are the old servant quarters, above the Tudor kitchens. They are the only rooms we can afford to heat." Armando leaned forward, planting his hands on the desk. He wanted to push her away, to isolate her before she could see the full, humiliating extent of his ruin. "I have no staff to wait on you. The modern kitchen in the annex collapsed last winter. The staff boils cabbage and oats over a hearth in the laundry. If you want better, madam, you are welcome to use the old kitchens below your quarters." He shoved the iron keys across the polished wood. "The Tudor kitchens have been abandoned for 50 years. They are filthy, freezing, and entirely yours. Consider it your domain. If you want to eat like a duchess, you will have to manage your own affairs." It was a cruel dismissal, a calculated humiliation meant to drive her to her chambers in shame, to keep her out of his way while he drowned in ledgers and ruin. Caitlin looked at his hands. His knuckles were white. He was a proud, drowning man lashing out at the only piece of driftwood in reach. She reached out and picked up the keys. The iron was freezing to the touch. "Breakfast is at 8, I assume?" she asked, her voice steady. Armando blinked, caught off guard by the absence of tears. "There is no formal breakfast." "There will be," Caitlin said. She slipped the keys into a deep pocket, turned on her heel, and walked out into the freezing corridor. Morning light did not so much break over Westford Abbey as it leaked, grey and reluctant, through the low clouds. Caitlin woke in a room that smelled of mildew. The mattress was thin, the hearth cold. She did not linger in the blankets. Rising quickly, she dressed herself in her plainest round gown, a sturdy dark blue wool, and tied an apron over it. She pinned her hair back ruthlessly. The south wing was a labyrinth of narrow, stone-flagged corridors. The air here was 10 degrees colder than the rest of the house. Caitlin carried a single tallow candle, letting the draught guide her down the winding stone stairs to the lowest level of the estate. She inserted the larger iron key into the heavy oak door at the bottom. It screamed in protest as she threw her shoulder against it, forcing it open. The air inside was thick and stale, carrying a heavy, ghost-like scent of centuries-old grease, wood smoke, and damp earth. Caitlin raised her candle. The Tudor kitchen was cavernous. It was built for an era when the Abbey housed hundreds. 3 massive stone hearths dominated the far wall, large enough to roast oxen whole. Blackened iron spits hung from rusted chains. The prep tables were thick slabs of oak, currently covered in a grey carpet of dust and cobwebs. Copper pots, tarnished green and black, were stacked haphazardly in the corners. Dead leaves had blown down the chimneys, scattering across the flagstones. It was a graveyard of feasting. "You'll break your neck in here, Your Grace." Caitlin turned. Standing in the doorway was a man in his late 50s. His left leg was braced with stiff leather, and his face was mapped with deep, cynical lines. He wore the faded livery of a butler, though his hands were raw and calloused like a ditch digger's. "And you are?" Caitlin asked. "Thorben Ortiz, estate manager, butler, groundskeeper, whatever the Duke needs me to be when the rest of the rats flee the ship." Ortiz limped into the room, kicking a ratty broom aside. "His Grace told me he gave you the keys. It's a bad joke, ma'am. Don't take it to heart. Go back upstairs. I'll bring you some tea and a slice of dry toast. It's all we have." "It wasn't a joke, Mr. Ortiz," Caitlin said, running a gloved finger over the nearest oak table. It left a thick, black trench in the dust. "It was a challenge, and I do not intend to starve in a house this large." Ortiz let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Starve? Ma'am, the Duke is starving. He eats 1 meal a day. He sells the wheat before it's even harvested to pay the London bankers. The pantries are empty. There is no wood for these hearths. There is no staff to turn the spits. This room has been dead since his grandfather's time. Then we shall resurrect it." Caitlin walked toward the central hearth. She looked up into the dark, yawning chimney. "Are the flues clear?" Ortiz stared at her as if she had lost her mind. "Birds have probably nested in there for 20 years. "Then we will smoke them out." Caitlin turned to face him, pulling off her gloves and tucking them into her apron pocket. "I need a bucket, harsh lye soap, a wire brush, and whatever able-bodied maids you have left. 2 will do. I have 3 scullery maids who are entirely feral and a boy who splits logs," Ortiz said, crossing his arms, "and none of them take orders from a lady playing house in the soot." "I am not playing, Mr. Ortiz." Caitlin's voice dropped, losing its polite veneer. It became hard, grounded in a reality she had known long before this marriage. Her family had been poor, desperately so, hiding their frayed collars behind closed doors. She knew how to stretch a shilling. She knew how to scrub a floor. "I am the Duchess of Westford. My dowry bought your master another year of pretending he is not ruined. I will not sit in a freezing room waiting for him to permit me to eat dry toast. Now, fetch the lie." Ortiz's jaw worked. He looked at her hands. They were not soft. There were faint, old burn marks on her wrists. He gave a slow, measured nod. "As you say, Your Grace." For the next 4 days, Caitlin did not see her husband. She practically lived in the cavernous dark of the old kitchens. It was brutal, back-breaking labor. She, alongside 2 bewildered, freezing scullery maids named Martha and Jane, scrubbed a half-century of grime from the stones. Caitlin knelt on the freezing floor, her hands submerged in bucket after bucket of caustic, biting lye. Her knuckles cracked and bled. The maids, initially sullen and resistant, fell silent when they saw the Duchess working twice as hard as they did, wiping sweat and soot from her forehead with a blackened forearm. They cleared the chimneys. A terrifying deluge of dead rooks, twigs, and decades of soot collapsed into the hearths, choking the room in black dust for an entire afternoon. They shoveled it out. They scrubbed the oak tables with sand and vinegar until the pale, beautiful wood shone through the neglect. Ortiz watched from the doorway, leaning on his cane. He didn't mock her again. On the third day, without being asked, he brought down a bundle of heavy, dry oak logs and stacked them by the central hearth. By the end of the 4th day, the kitchen was clean. It was hollow, echoing, and entirely empty of food. But it was clean. Caitlin stood in the center of the room, her back aching violently, her muscles trembling from exhaustion. She looked at the massive, empty iron cauldron suspended over the central hearth. "Now," Caitlin breathed, her breath pluming in the freezing air. "We need something to cook." Pride was an expensive luxury, and Armando Coleman could no longer afford it. He sat in his study, staring at the leather-bound ledgers. The numbers were a death sentence in black ink. The winter was going to be brutal. He had sold off the last of his prime breeding horses yesterday, just to cover the interest on the northern mortgages. He had intentionally avoided his new wife. Guilt gnawed at his ribs, tight and uncomfortable. He knew he had been savage to her on the night of her arrival. He had given her an abandoned ruin to humiliate her, hoping she would demand to go back to London, hoping he wouldn't have to look at the woman whose modest dowry he had swallowed whole just to survive the month. But Caitlin hadn't complained. In fact, he hadn't heard a sound from the south wing. She is probably huddled under her blankets, weeping. Armando thought bitterly, rubbing his temples. "I will have Ortiz send her up some tea." He stood, intending to pull the bell rope. Then he stopped. A scent was drifting under the heavy oak door of his study. Armando closed his eyes. It had been years since the Abbey smelled of anything but dust, wet wool, and boiled cabbage. But this was the rich, intoxicating aroma of roasting fat, of onions sweating in butter, of garlic, thyme, and heavy dark meat simmering in a thick broth. His stomach cramped violently. He swallowed hard, his mouth watering in a way that felt entirely involuntary. He opened his study door. The corridor was freezing, but the smell was stronger here. It was winding its way up from the lower levels. Down in the Tudor kitchens, a fire roared for the first time in 50 years. Caitlin stood before the central hearth, the heat turning her pale face flush. The sheer scale of the fire cast dancing, golden light across the vast stone room, pushing back the damp chill that had lived there for decades. Getting the ingredients had cost her the pearl hairpin her grandmother had given her. She had walked 3 miles to the village that morning, ignoring Ortiz's protests. The local butcher, a massive man who hated the Duke for unpaid bills, had laughed when she asked for credit. Caitlin hadn't argued. She calmly withdrew the gold and pearl pin from her hair, laid it on the bloody chopping block, and asked for a side of beef ribs, 2 sacks of flour, a crate of root vegetables, and a block of salted butter. Now the massive iron cauldron bubbled furiously. It was a peasant stew, elevated by necessity. Beef bones roasted until they were black and marrow-rich, dropped into boiling water with carrots, thick cuts of onion, and crushed garlic. She had spent 2 hours kneading dough on the clean oak tables, and now heavy loaves of rustic bread were baking on the hot stones near the fire. The kitchen, once a tomb, felt alive. Martha and Jane, the scullery maids, were huddled near the warmth, their eyes wide as they watched the cauldron. They had never seen so much food in one place. "Stir it from the bottom, Martha," Caitlin instructed, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. "Don't let the meat stick to the iron." Ortiz stepped into the kitchen. He stopped just inside the doorway. The harsh lines of his face softened as the wall of heat hit him. He looked at the bubbling cauldron, then at the fresh bread, and finally at Caitlin. "Your Grace," Ortiz murmured. "Are the rest of the staff upstairs, Mr. Ortiz?" Caitlin asked, not looking up as she chopped a handful of dried parsley she had scavenged from the overgrown greenhouse. "They are, huddled in the laundry room. Tell them to come down," Caitlin said. "Dinner is ready." "Ma'am, the staff cannot dine in the presence of the Duchess. It goes against every rule of—" "The rules died when the bank took the silver, Mr. Ortiz." Caitlin interrupted, her voice firm, though her eyes were kind. "I made enough for 30 men. There are 12 of us. Bring them down. No one sleeps cold on an empty stomach tonight." Ortiz hesitated, then gave a deep, stiff bow, the first real bow he had given her since she arrived. "Yes, Your Grace." Within 20 minutes, the cavernous kitchen was filled with hesitant, wide-eyed servants, footmen with threadbare coats, shivering housemaids, and the old stable-master. They clustered near the edges of the room, intimidated by the Duchess, who stood by the fire with a wooden ladle. Caitlin didn't give a speech. She simply took a stack of wooden bowls she had scrubbed clean that morning, filled them to the brim with thick, rich stew, and handed them out. She broke the hot, crusty bread with her bare hands, passing large chunks to the freezing staff. Silence fell over the room, broken only by the frantic scraping of wooden spoons. Caitlin took a bowl for herself, sitting on a low wooden stool by the fire. Her back screamed in agony, her hands throbbed from the lye, but the hot broth sliding down her throat felt like a victory. She looked toward the doorway. Standing in the shadows of the stone archway, completely hidden from the staff but visible to her, was Armando. He was staring at her. The haughty, cold Duke was gone. In his place was a man watching a miracle unfold in the basement of his ruined life. He looked at the heavy bowls of food, at his starving staff eating their fill, and then his eyes locked onto Caitlin. Caitlin held his gaze. She didn't smile. She didn't offer him a bowl. She simply sat by the fire she had built in the ruin he had given her, and ate. Armando swallowed hard, his throat working. He stood there for a long moment, the scent of the hearth wrapping around him. Then slowly, he stepped back into the shadows and retreated up the stairs, leaving his pride bleeding on the stone floor. Ice coated the mullioned windows of the study, forming jagged, opaque claws that blocked out the morning sun. Armando Coleman sat at his mahogany desk, a ledger open before him, the ink blurring together into a meaningless swarm of black numerals. He had not slept. His stomach completely hollowed out by pride and a meager ration of stale toast, twisted into sharp, physical knots. Below him, deep in the bedrock of the Abbey, he could hear a sound that had been entirely absent from his home for 5 years. It was the faint, muffled rhythm of life. The dull thud of a heavy knife meeting a chopping block, the distant scrape of iron on stone, the occasional hushed murmur of voices. His servants, his shrinking, miserable retinue, were no longer lingering in the freezing upper corridors, looking like ghosts awaiting the gallows. They had all migrated to the Tudor kitchens. They had migrated to her. Ortiz entered the study without knocking. The old estate manager carried a silver tray holding a single teacup and a thin, miserable slice of dry bread. Armando stared at the bread. It looked like sawdust compressed into a square. "Your breakfast, Your Grace," Ortiz said, his voice completely flat. "Take it away, Ortiz." Armando dragged a hand over his exhausted face. "I am not hungry." "You are starving, sir." "As we all were." Ortiz did not move the tray. He stood his ground, leaning slightly on his stiff leg. "The men are working the south stables today. They have the energy for it. William even repaired the collapsed roof on the woodshed. The Duchess had them up at dawn." Armando flinched at the title. The Duchess! Caitlin! He had handed her the rusted keys as an insult, a cynical test designed to break a pampered girl's spirit. Instead, she had seized the iron, built a fire, and fed his people while he hid in his study crunching numbers that always ended in ruin. "Is she demanding the silver to sell next?" Armando asked, his tone laced with a defensive bitterness. "She demands nothing, Your Grace." Ortiz finally set the tray down. "But she is outside your door." Armando stiffened. Before he could issue a denial, the heavy oak door creaked open. Caitlin walked in. She was not wearing the silk morning gowns he remembered the society women of London wearing. She wore her dark blue wool dress, a heavy apron tied securely around her waist, and her sleeves rolled up past her elbows. Her forearms were dusted with white flour. In her hands, she carried a heavy, unpolished wooden bowl. Thick, fragrant steam rose from the bowl, carrying the heavy scent of roasted beef, root vegetables, and rich, salted broth. Beside the bowl rested a massive heel of fresh, crusty bread. Armando's mouth watered instantly. His body betrayed his pride in a heartbeat. Caitlin walked to the desk, smoothly pushed his damning ledger to the side, and set the wooden bowl down in front of him. "Eat," she said. It was not a request. Armando stared at the steam rising from the dark broth. "I told you upon your arrival, madam. We do not have the provisions for this. If you have spent your dowry allowance already on a single feast for the staff, you are a fool. I spent a pearl hairpin." Caitlin corrected him, her voice perfectly even. "It bought us enough beef and flour to last 4 days if we stretch the broth. 3 days if your men continue doing heavy labor. But I am not a magician, Armando. When the flour is gone, it is gone. I need a sustainable line of provisions, and the village butcher will not extend credit to this estate." She used his Christian name. It stripped the title away, leaving just a man and a woman negotiating their survival in a freezing room. Armando finally looked up at her. Her face was pale, devoid of rouge or powder, but her eyes were sharp, calculating, and entirely unafraid of him. He realized then that she was not a fragile London flower. She was iron masquerading as silk. "I have no money, Caitlin. The winter cellars are empty." "I am not asking for money." Caitlin placed her hands flat on the desk, leaning in. "I am asking for access to the estate's dormant resources. The land is not dead. It is merely unmanaged." She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of parchment. She slapped it onto the desk beside the bowl of stew. It was a list written in precise, sharp handwriting. "These are my terms if I am to keep your household from freezing or starving by Christmas," Caitlin said. Armando looked at the paper. The armory keys. Unrestricted access to the fowling pieces, a hunting rifle, and dry powder. the game reserve, permission to cull the deer and trap the rabbits in the eastern woods. The root cellar, the heavy iron keys to the sealed cellars beneath the old greenhouse. Labor. The groundskeeper and the 2 footmen are to report to the kitchen at dawn to split wood. Armando let out a harsh, incredulous breath. You want to poach your own lands? I have no gamekeeper. The man left a year ago when I couldn't pay his wages. Who exactly do you intend to send into the freezing woods to shoot a stag? William? The boy is terrified of his own shadow. Caitlin didn't blink. She looked down at him, her gaze travelling over his broad shoulders, assessing him with brutal practicality. You have 2 legs, 2 arms, and a working eye, Your Grace. Or do you only shoot birds when other men flush them out for sport? Silence fell over the study, thick and suffocating. Ortiz, still standing near the door, suddenly found the ceiling architecture utterly fascinating. Armando stared at her, anger flaring in his chest. It was an insult, a direct challenge to his manhood and his utility. He was a duke. He did not scavenge for his supper in the mud. I am managing the creditors, Armando said through gritted teeth. I am trying to save this house. You are sinking with it, Caitlin replied, refusing to back down. And you are taking your people with you. A ledger will not fill a stomach, Armando. Eat the stew, then get your rifle. We need meat. She turned on her heel and walked out of the study, her boots echoing sharply on the floorboards. Ortiz gave a quick, shallow bow and scrambled out after her. Armando sat alone in the freezing room. He looked at the ledger, a hopeless ocean of debt. Then he looked at the steaming bowl of stew. His hand trembled as he picked up the wooden spoon. He took a bite. The rich, savory heat exploded in his mouth, sliding down his throat and hitting his empty stomach like a burst of pure energy. It was the best thing he had tasted in years. He didn't stop to breathe. He ate like a starving animal, scraping the bowl clean and using the crusty bread to mop up the last drops of grease. When he was finished, he sat back, the warmth radiating outward through his chest. He looked at the piece of parchment Caitlin had left behind. Slowly, Armando stood up, walked to the heavy oak cabinet in the corner of his study, and unlocked it. He reached past the ceremonial swords and pulled out a heavy, double-barreled hunting rifle. Frost snapped violently under the heavy leather of Armando's boots, breaking the deathly silence of the eastern woods. The cold was absolute, a bitter, biting wind that sliced right through his wool coat. He had been walking for 3 hours. His fingers gripping the frozen steel of the rifle barrel were completely numb. He hadn't tracked an animal himself since he was a boy, trailing after his father's master of the hunt. Now, there were no hounds, no beaters, just a desperate man stalking the tree line, praying for a mistake from the local wildlife. He found the tracks near a half-frozen stream. Roe deer. Armando slowed his breathing, dropping into a low crouch. The aristocratic posture drummed into him from birth was entirely useless here. He crawled through the damp bracken, his trousers soaking through with freezing mud. He didn't care. He was entirely focused on the hunt. An hour later, the crack of his rifle echoed through the hollow valley. When Armando returned to the Abbey, the sun was already bleeding a bruised purple into the horizon. He did not come through the grand front doors. He bypassed the formal courtyard entirely, dragging his heavy, exhausted legs toward the servants' entrance at the back of the estate. He was dragging a heavy wooden sled behind him. Strapped to the boards was a massive, bloody stag. His shoulders burned, his lungs felt like they were lined with broken glass, and his expensive coat was ruined with blood and dirt. But as he hauled the sled into the flickering light of the back courtyard, a strange, feral satisfaction settled in his chest. The door to the scullery opened. William, the young footman, stepped out to empty a bucket of dirty water. The boy froze, his jaw dropping as he took in the sight of the Duke of Westford, covered in mud and blood, hauling a dead stag like a common poacher. "Fetch the Duchess," Armando ordered, his voice hoarse from the cold. William dropped the bucket and ran. A moment later, Caitlin emerged into the freezing courtyard. She had traded her apron for a heavy wool shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She walked down the stone steps and stopped in front of the sled, looking down at the massive animal. She did not gasp. She did not cover her mouth in horror at the sight of the blood. She simply assessed the weight of the meat. A clean shot to the neck. Caitlin observed, her breath pluming in the icy air. She looked up at Armando. His face was grey with exhaustion, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with freezing sweat. "Will it suffice?" Armando asked. He hated that his voice held a faint, pathetic thread of seeking approval. "It will feed us for 3 weeks if we salt the haunches and smoke the rest," Caitlin said. She stepped closer to him. She didn't offer a flowery compliment or a dramatic de-Caitlintion of gratitude. They both knew the stakes were too high for theatrics. "You did well, Armando. Bring it inside. The blood will freeze to the meat if we leave it out here." She turned and yelled orders into the scullery, demanding boiling water and the sharpest knives they possessed. The Tudor kitchen became an abattoir. Armando did not leave. He stripped off his ruined coat, rolled up his blood-stained sleeves, and helped Ortiz haul the heavy carcass onto one of the massive oak tables. For the next 3 hours, the Duke, the Duchess, and the estate manager worked shoulder to shoulder in the suffocating heat of the roaring central hearth. It was grueling, visceral work. Caitlin was ruthless in her efficiency. She showed no squeamishness, plunging her bare hands into the carcass to remove the offal, instructing Martha to save the fat for rendering and the bones for stock. There was no waste. Every ounce of the animal was a victory against the winter. Armando watched her as he sawed through the heavy bone of the hindquarters. Her knuckles were raw and cracked, bleeding slightly into the flour and grease that coated her hands. There were fresh, angry burn marks on her inner wrists from reaching over the heavy iron spits. She was pushing herself past the limits of physical endurance, driven by a terrifying, stubborn will to survive. By midnight, the meat was butchered, salted, and hung in the cold stone pantries adjoining the kitchen. The staff had collapsed into their beds, exhausted but secure in the knowledge that they would not starve tomorrow. The kitchen was empty, save for the low, dying embers of the central hearth, casting a dull orange glow over the freshly scrubbed oak tables. The heavy scent of iron and wood smoke hung thick in the air. Armando walked down the stone steps from his study, carrying a plain ceramic jug of water. He had gone upstairs to wash, but the upper floors were entirely dead, freezing and hollow. The only warmth in the entire estate was down here. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs. Caitlin was sitting on a low wooden stool near the embers. She was fast asleep. Her head leaned against the rough stone of the fireplace arch, her heavy wool shawl pulled tight around her. Her hands lay limp in her lap, palms facing up. Armando stepped closer, his boots making no sound on the flagstones. He looked down at her hands. In the dim light of the embers, the damage was undeniable. Blisters from the lye soap, burns from the iron pots, deep, painful calluses forming on a woman who had been raised to play the pianoforte and pour tea. She was destroying herself to keep his household alive. Armando set the jug of water down on the table. He reached down and gently, very carefully, took her hands in his. Caitlin shifted in her sleep, a small, tired sound escaping her throat. But she didn't wake. Her hands were freezing. Armando frowned. He unbuttoned his heavy, clean wool coat, the only warm garment he had left that wasn't covered in blood, and draped it over her shoulders, tucking it carefully around her shivering frame. He didn't return to his freezing bedroom in the west wing. Armando pulled another wooden stool up to the dying fire, sitting down beside his wife. He stretched his aching legs out toward the embers, folded his arms across his chest, and for the first time since his father died, he slept deeply, guarded by the warmth of a kitchen he had abandoned. December tightened its grip on the valley, freezing the muddy tracks of the courtyard into treacherous ridges of solid ice. The moors turned a brilliant, blinding white under a heavy snowfall. Inside Westford Abbey, the geography of power had fundamentally shifted. The grand drawing rooms and the gilded, freezing upper galleries were abandoned entirely to the ghosts. Life, heat, and survival were concentrated in the cavernous Tudor kitchens. Caitlin stood before the central hearth, evaluating their hanging larder. The venison was holding out, heavily salted and swaying gently from the iron hooks in the cold pantry. But protein alone would not sustain men splitting logs in freezing temperatures. The flour was dangerously low. The root vegetables were nearly gone. "The keys to the greenhouse cellars," Caitlin said, holding her hand out to Ortiz. The old estate manager sighed, his breath visible in the chilly air of the corridor, just outside the kitchen's heavy warmth. "The locks have rusted solid, Your Grace. The last gardener lost the key in the mud 10 years ago, and we simply boarded it up. Then we pry it open." A heavy iron crowbar slid onto the oak prep table with a dull, ringing thud. Caitlin turned. Armando stood there, wearing a heavy wool sweater that had seen better days, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows. The aristocratic pallor he had worn like a shroud on their wedding day was gone. A week of heavy labor and proper meals had put color in his cheeks. He looked dangerous, capable, and entirely awake. "Show me the door," Armando said. The three of them tramped out into the biting wind, crossing the frozen expanse of the ruined formal gardens. The glass of the greenhouse had shattered years ago, leaving a skeletal iron frame jutting out of the snow like the ribs of a dead leviathan. Beneath it, half buried under a snowdrift, were the heavy oak storm doors leading to the subterranean root cellars. Armando did not bother searching for a key. He wedged the flat edge of the crowbar into the frozen gap between the timber and the rusted iron padlock. He braced his boots against the stone frame, his breath coming in sharp, white bursts, and threw his entire weight backward. Wood splintered. The rusted metal gave a sharp shriek, and the padlock snapped, bouncing off the ice. Armando threw the heavy doors open, revealing a plunging set of stone stairs descending into absolute darkness. Caitlin lit the lantern she carried and stepped down first, ignoring the stench of damp earth and rot. The main cellar was a disappointment. The wooden storage bins, built to hold potatoes, turnips, and winter squashes, were entirely empty. They had been picked clean years ago, leaving only a thick carpet of white mold and mouse droppings. Caitlin's shoulders dropped. She had been banking on a forgotten cache of winter stores. "Nothing," Ortiz muttered, kicking a broken wooden slat. "I told you, Mom, the estate was drained dry." Armando walked slowly past the empty bins, holding the lantern high. He dragged his hand along the back wall, his brow furrowed. "This isn't right." "What isn't?" Caitlin asked, moving to stand beside him. "The foundation line." Armando tapped the heavy iron head of the crowbar against the stone wall. It made a solid, dull sound. Then he stepped 3 paces to his left and tapped again. Thwack! Hollow. "My grandfather expanded the cellars in 82, Armando said, his voice dropping to a low, calculating register. He dug back into the limestone to store the harvest. "This wall is new. It's brick, covered in a sloppy layer of mortar." He didn't wait for a discussion. Armando swung the heavy iron bar over his shoulder and drove it violently into the center of the wall. Mortar cracked. Dust rained down in thick sheets. Caitlin covered her mouth with her shawl as Armando struck it again. And then a 3rd time. On the 4th strike, a large section of the false wall caved inward, revealing a pitch-black cavity. Armando cleared the jagged edges of brick with his gloved hands and stepped through the breach. Caitlin followed, holding the lantern high. The golden light hit glass. Hundreds of them. The hidden chamber was perfectly climate-controlled, insulated by the deep earth. Racks upon racks of dark green glass bottles lay on their sides, thickly coated in a decade of dust. Caitlin stepped closer, rubbing a thumb over a filthy label. "Bordeaux," Caitlin whispered. She moved to the next rack. And port. Heavy, aged port. Armando stood perfectly still. His jaw was locked so tight the muscle twitched. My father. He didn't sell it to pay the creditors. He walled it up. He hid the best vintages down here while the staff upstairs ate boiled cabbage and his son faced debtor's prison. The betrayal in his voice was thick and bitter. He looked at the bottles as if he wanted to smash every single one of them against the stones. "Armando." Caitlin's voice was sharp, cutting through his rising anger. She stepped in front of him, forcing him to look at her instead of the wine. "Do not waste energy on the dead. Your father hid this. Good. That means the bank doesn't know it exists, and neither do the merchants in the village." Armando blinked, pulling his gaze away from the racks. "You want me to drink to our ruin? I want you to trade it." Caitlin corrected him, her eyes fierce in the lantern light. "We don't need gold. Gold cannot be eaten. We need oats. We need barley. We need sugar, salt, and fat. We need a butcher willing to barter." Ortiz let out a low whistle, doing the mental mathematics. "That's a small fortune in glass, Your Grace. The local tavern owner would sell his own mother for a dozen bottles of that port." Armando looked at the wine, then at Caitlin. The bitterness slowly drained from his face, replaced by a hard, unyielding pragmatism that mirrored her own. "Ortiz," Armando said, his voice steady. "Hitch the draft horse to the flatbed wagon. Put down heavy straw to pad the ride." The village of Oakhaven lay 3 miles down the valley, a tight cluster of slate-roofed cottages and stone storefronts, huddled around a freezing river. The locals had long since grown accustomed to the neglect of Westford Abbey. The Duke was a phantom, a ruined aristocrat who owed half the merchant's money and hid behind his crumbling walls. So, when a heavy flatbed wagon rattled across the cobblestone bridge, driven not by a servant, but by the Duke of Westford himself, the village square fell into a stunned silence. Armando wore his heavy winter coat, the collar turned up against the biting wind. He pulled back on the leather reins, bringing the massive draft horse to a halt directly in front of the butcher's shop. He tied off the reins, hopped down from the bench, and walked to the back of the wagon. He didn't swagger. He didn't demand an audience. He simply hauled a heavy wooden crate from the wagon bed, balanced it on his shoulder, and walked through the door of the butcher's shop. Elias Miller, a man the size of an anvil with hands to match, stood behind the bloody counter. He had flatly refused Caitlin credit 2 weeks prior. He glared at Armando. "Your Grace," Miller said, the title dripping with thinly veiled contempt. "I told your wife? No more meat on credit. The Abbey's word isn't worth the paper it's written on." Armando set the heavy wooden crate down on the chopping block. It landed with a heavy, expensive thud. He pulled a crowbar from his belt and pried the lid off, revealing 12 bottles of pristine, dust-coated Bordeaux, packed securely in straw. "I am not asking for credit, Miller," Armando said, pulling a bottle from the straw and setting it upright on the counter. "I am offering a trade." Miller frowned, picking up the bottle. He wiped the dust from the label with a meaty thumb. His eyebrows shot up. "This is a French vintage. Smuggled, likely. The war made this impossible to get. It has been in my cellars for 20 years, Armando said evenly. "I have 6 more crates outside. I want 50 pounds of salted pork, 2 sides of cured bacon, a barrel of your best rendering fat, and your word that you will secure me 2 sacks of rolled oats from the miller next door, and I want it loaded into my wagon today." Miller set the bottle down, narrowing his eyes. "You're selling off the family cellar to buy bacon." "I am feeding my people," Armando replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The haughty arrogance was gone, replaced by a fierce, territorial, protective instinct. "Will you make the trade, or shall I take it to the tavern down the road and let him buy out your meat supply with the profits?" Miller looked at the Duke. He saw the calluses forming on the nobleman's hands. He saw the dirt on his boots and the unyielding set of his jaw. The village had thought Armando Coleman was a soft, dying man. The man standing in the shop was anything but. Miller extended a massive, blood-stained hand. "Deal, Your Grace." By mid-afternoon, the wagon was heavy with provisions: sacks of flour, oats, salt, a massive wheel of hard cheese, and thick cuts of cured meat filled the bed. Armando drove the wagon back up the winding road to the Abbey, his muscles burning from the loading, but his chest feeling lighter than it had in a decade. He pulled the wagon into the back courtyard just as the sun began to set, casting long purple shadows across the snow. Caitlin was waiting on the stone steps. She had heard the heavy crunch of the wagon wheels on the ice. She stepped down, peering into the back of the wagon. When she saw the sheer volume of food, her breath caught. She reached out, resting a gloved hand on a massive sack of flour. It was real, tangible security. "You did it," Caitlin breathed, looking up at him. "We did it," Armando corrected, jumping down from the bench. He waved Ortiz and William over to begin unloading the supplies, but before he joined them, he reached deep into his heavy coat pocket. He pulled out a small, roughly tied paper parcel and held it out to Caitlin. "What is this?" she asked, hesitating. "Open it." Caitlin untied the coarse twine. Inside the brown paper was a small tin of black tea, real, unadulterated tea leaves, not the bitter roots they had been boiling, and 3 small, precious lumps of crystallized sugar. She stared at it, a sudden, unfamiliar tightness gripping her throat. She had faced the freezing kitchen without a tear. She had butchered a stag without flinching. But this small, completely unnecessary luxury, bought with whatever meager leverage he had left, broke right through her armor. "Armando," she whispered, her voice rough. "You haven't stopped working since the moment I gave you those keys," Armando said quietly, stepping close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "I wanted you to have a moment of warmth that you didn't have to build yourself." Caitlin looked up. The cold, cynical barrier between them had completely dissolved. She didn't say thank you. The words felt too small. Instead, she carefully folded the paper parcel, tucked it into her apron, and nodded toward the heavy sacks in the wagon. "Then let's get this inside," Caitlin said, a fierce, genuine smile finally breaking across her face. "I am making a proper roast tonight." By the 3rd week of December, the Tudor kitchen had developed a distinct, undeniable gravitational pull. The rest of Westford Abbey remained a frozen tomb of sheet-covered furniture and echoing hallways, but the subterranean levels hummed with a fierce, concentrated life. It smelled of survival. The heavy, comforting aromas of baked oats, rendered fat, and drying rosemary hung thick in the warm air. The social hierarchy of the estate had completely disintegrated, burned away in the massive central hearth. William, the nervous young footman, no longer stood at attention. He chopped wood with a steady, rhythmic confidence, his shoulders broadening from the daily labor. Martha and Jane, once sullen and feral, laughed as they kneaded heavy dough on the oak tables. Even Ortiz walked with less of a limp, his cynical edge softened by the sheer novelty of a full stomach. Armando had abandoned his study entirely. He moved a scarred wooden table into the corner of the kitchen nearest the pantry archway. It was there, amidst the clatter of cast-iron pans and the hiss of boiling water, that the Duke of Westford balanced his ledgers. He no longer wore his tailored coats. He wore coarse wool, his shirt sleeves perpetually rolled up, exposing forearms corded with new muscle from hauling water and butchering meat. He watched Caitlin. He rarely tried to hide it anymore. She was a force of nature wrapped in a flour-dusted apron. The brutal work had stripped away the polite, quiet spinster he had married, revealing a woman of terrifying competence and sharp, sudden warmth. Her hands were rough, permanently scarred by the lye and iron, yet Armando found his gaze drawn to them constantly. He watched how gently she bandaged a cut on William's thumb, and how ruthlessly she drove a butcher's knife through a joint of salted pork. "You are staring again, Armando." Caitlin didn't look up from the large wooden bowl resting on her hip. She was vigorously whipping a mixture of eggs and the precious sugar he had traded for, the wooden spoon striking the sides in a rapid beat. Armando leaned back in his chair, tapping a dried quill against his inkwell. "I am calculating our stores. There is a difference. You are calculating the odds of me dropping this bowl," Caitlin corrected, finally shooting him a brief, knowing look. She wiped a stray strand of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a faint streak of flour near her eyebrow. "We have enough flour for 2 more weeks, but the salted pork will see us through January, provided we stretch it with the root vegetables." Ortiz limped into the kitchen, carrying an armful of split logs. He dumped them unceremoniously by the hearth, brushing the sawdust from his coat. 3 days to Christmas, Your Grace," Ortiz said, aiming the statement at the room in general. "The village is completely snowed in. The roads are impassable." Silence fell over the kitchen. The rhythmic chopping and stirring ceased. Christmas in the Abbey had been a dead affair for half a decade. A day to bitterly ignore the cold and ration the remaining firewood. Caitlin stopped stirring. She looked around the massive stone room, taking in the tired, soot-stained faces of the staff who had worked themselves to the bone to keep the estate alive. She looked at the heavy iron spits, the full pantry, and finally at Armando. "We are holding a feast," Caitlin announced. Ortiz blinked. "Mum? A feast. Not a rationed meal. Not a stew meant to stretch for 4 days." Caitlin set the heavy bowl down on the oak table. The iron in her spine was evident, sharp and unyielding. "We have worked like dogs in the dirt for 6 weeks. We have survived the worst of the freeze. We are going to celebrate that fact, or we are going to lose our minds to the winter." Armando stood up from his desk. He walked slowly across the flagstones, the heat of the fire casting long, dancing shadows behind him. He stopped in front of Caitlin, looking down at her determined, soot-smudged face. "A feast requires more than just extra meat, Caitlin," Armando said, his voice a low, gravelly hum. "It requires a celebration, something to lift the spirit. We have no decorations. We have no musicians. We have warmth," Caitlin replied, refusing to back down. "And we have a home that is no longer dying. That is enough." Armando studied her eyes. The cynical, defensive shell he had worn for years was entirely gone. In its place was a profound, grounding respect for the woman standing before him. "It is," Armando agreed softly. He turned to the estate manager. "Ortiz, take William into the eastern woods, bring the axes, find the largest, healthiest pine tree you can carry, and drag it down here. Cut as much holly and winterberry as you can find." Ortiz's weathered face broke into a massive, genuine grin. "Yes, Your Grace." Armando looked back at Caitlin, a faint, rare smile touching the corners of his mouth. "If the Duchess requires a feast, she shall have one." "Oh!" Snow fell in thick, silent curtains on Christmas Eve, burying the crumbling ruins of Westford Abbey under a blanket of pure, untouched white. But below the frozen earth, the Tudor kitchen was a cathedral of light and heat. The transformation was absolute. Massive boughs of green pine and red winterberry were draped over the rough stone arches, filling the heavy air with the sharp, clean scent of the forest. The long oak prep tables had been pushed together in the center of the room, scrubbed until the wood gleamed, and set with every piece of mismatched ceramic and tin the estate possessed. Dozens of tallow candles, saved meticulously by Caitlin over the last month, burned fiercely in rusted iron candelabras, casting a warm, golden glow over the stone walls. The food was a testament to sheer, stubborn survival. The iron spits groaned under the weight of a massive, heavily spiced venison roast, its fat crackling and spitting into the flames below. There were deep, savory pies filled with salted pork and minced root vegetables, their thick crusts baked to a dark, golden brown. Caitlin had used the last of the white flour and sugar to bake a dense, heavy fruit cake, studded with dried apples she had found hidden in a forgotten pantry corner. Beside it sat 2 of the remaining bottles of Armando's smuggled Bordeaux, opened and breathing in the warm air. At 7 o'clock, the entire household sat down. There was no head of the table, no division of class. Armando sat on a wooden bench between Ortiz and William. Caitlin sat across from him, flanked by Martha and Jane. They were a ruined duke, a desperate duchess, and a ragged staff, entirely bound together by the mud, the soot, and the fire. Armando poured the wine himself, filling the chipped ceramic mugs of the scullery maids with the same expensive vintage he drank. When every cup was full, Armando stood. The kitchen fell dead silent. The crackle of the hearth was the only sound. Armando looked around the table. He saw the calluses on William's hands. He saw the exhaustion lining Ortiz's eyes. And then he looked at Caitlin. She was wearing her dark blue wool dress, completely unadorned, her hair pinned back, her skin flushed from the heat of the fire. To Armando, she looked like a queen holding court in a fortress of stone. 2 months ago, Armando began, his voice steady, echoing slightly against the vaulted ceiling. I stood in a freezing hallway upstairs and handed my wife a set of rusted keys. I did it because I was a coward. I was a proud, drowning man, terrified of my own ruin, and I wanted to hide it from her. I gave her an abandoned ruin, fully expecting her to break. He paused, his throat working. He met Caitlin's gaze, and for the first time, he stripped away every defense he had left. She did not break. Armando continued quietly. She took the keys, she built a fire, and she dragged this family back from the edge of the grave. She taught me that true nobility has absolutely nothing to do with a title, and everything to do with what you are willing to build with your own 2 bare hands. He raised his chipped tin mug. To the Duchess, Armando said, his voice thick with emotion. The keeper of the fire. To the Duchess! Ortiz barked, raising his mug high. The rest of the staff echoed the cry, slamming their cups against the heavy oak table. Caitlin's vision blurred. A sudden sharp ache seized her chest, not from pain, but from the overwhelming, terrifying weight of being entirely seen and completely valued. She raised her own mug in return, her hands trembling just slightly, and took a deep drink of the heavy red wine. The feast lasted for hours. The food was demolished, the wine was drunk, and for the first time in years, genuine, raucous laughter echoed through the bedrock of Westford Abbey. It was well past midnight when the staff finally retreated to their makeshift beds in the adjoining warm rooms, completely exhausted and comfortably full. The kitchen was empty again. The grand central hearth had burned down to a thick bed of glowing, angry red coals. Caitlin stood by the long table, quietly stacking the dirty plates. Her back ached, a deep, familiar throb, but she couldn't wipe the lingering smile from her face. Footsteps approached from behind, heavy, deliberate. Armando stepped into her space. He reached out and gently took the heavy ceramic plate from her hands, setting it back down on the table. He didn't speak. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy iron ring. It held a single, massive key. It was entirely free of rust, polished until the iron gleamed black in the low light. "What is this?" Caitlin asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The key to the front doors of the Abbey," Armando said. He stepped closer, eliminating the space between them. The scent of pine, smoke, and wine clung to his clothes. "You proved you could survive the basement, Caitlin. But you are the master of this house, the entire house. When the thaw comes, we are opening the upper floors. We will scrub them raw if we have to, but we are doing it together." He placed the heavy iron key in her palm, folding her calloused, rough fingers over the metal with his own. Caitlin looked up at him. The flickering light of the coals caught the sharp angles of his face, the dark intensity in his eyes. She didn't see a ruined duke. She saw a partner, a man who had bled in the snow beside her to keep their people alive. "Armando," she breathed. He didn't wait for her to finish. Armando cupped her face with both hands, his thumbs grazing her cheekbones, and kissed her. It wasn't a polite, aristocratic kiss. It was desperate, grounded, and entirely real. It tasted of heavy wine and wood smoke. Caitlin gripped the lapels of his coarse wool coat, anchoring herself against him, kissing him back with the same fierce, unyielding passion she had poured into their survival. When they finally broke apart, Armando rested his forehead against hers. They were both breathing hard, standing in the center of a forgotten kitchen that had become the center of their world. "Happy Christmas, Caitlin," Armando whispered. Caitlin smiled, the heavy iron key tight in her fist. "Happy Christmas, Armando." The winter raged on outside the thick stone walls, bitter and merciless. But down in the bedrock, the fire was roaring, and the cold would never touch them again. If this story of grit, survival, and unexpected romance kept you warm against the winter chill, hit that like button and share it with someone who loves a truly grounded historical drama. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss out on our next original storytelling experience. What was your favorite moment from the Tudor kitchen? Let me know down in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time, stay warm and keep the fire burning.